Welcome to another of our Wednesday yachting luncheons. You can't get a better view at your yachting luncheon window than the one we have at our windows. So welcome everybody. It's fun for us to be up in the new year with the Wednesday yachting luncheon. To kick things off, let's have our new Vice Commodore Bill Dana come and welcome everybody. Come on up, Billy. Come on up, Billy.
Thanks, Ron. Welcome to another beautiful day in the grill room. Last week, I got to report on a great general meeting and a very successful year, thanks to a lot of people, including a bunch of people over here, Chairman Kayard, Chris Perkins, Commodore Heineken. This week, I get to report the San Francisco 49ers are going to the Super Bowl, which is pretty exciting. Where's Grant? I thought Grant was going to go, there he is, yeah. So if you haven't watched a playoff game or a Super Bowl in this room, the Yacht Club does a fantastic job, and it's a ton of fun. It's lively, and so I certainly encourage you to consider coming and watching the Super Bowl in a week and a half. Another thing is this weekend, I think they call it the biggest regatta in the country. It's called the Three British Fiasco, and you have to go around 3 marks, 2 islands, and Christie Field mark. Got to do something about this microphone. There we go. I'm going to break my neck since I'm leaning over. So if you're not sailing in it and you want to do some spectating, it'll be close to 400 boats going around here in each direction. It's a very funky format. Small keel boats, big keel boats, single-handed or double-handed, but it's a blast. So we did pretty well last year. Hoping to do better this time. So in any case, that's a fun thing to do as well. So anyway, Ron, take it over. Thanks, Glenn.
On you, Billy. Thank you, bud. Thank you. Let's see. Is this mic still happening here? Tommy, is there mic still happening here? Let's see a little bit about future speakers. So how many in this room have turned 90? Hands up, hands up, hands up. Okay, just a few of you. Well, you want to be here in a couple of weeks because our own Jimmy DeWitt, who is a champion sailor, having won the Mallory Cup, and an acknowledged beautiful painter, he'll be here to celebrate his 90th and do a Wednesday yachting luncheon with all of his great photography. Who else has been the official artist of the America's Cup? Hands up, hands up. Jimmy DeWitt has done that as well. So you want to come by on February the 5th. On Feb 12th, John Kirchmer, he has, I think, 300,000 ocean miles. Paul Kayard, how many ocean miles do you have, mate? Not 300,000. Anybody got 300,000? I got about 50, so 300 is way out there. He'll be here. He's done basically enough ocean racing, the equivalent of sailing to the moon and a third of the way back. He'll be here to talk about his 9 books and his completely passionate love of learning about life through the ocean. And next week, who's heard about the Ocean Film Festival? The International Ocean Film Festival. Well, the founder, Anna Blanco, is here, and she'll be here to talk all about it. She's with us today. Hold up your hand. Where's Anna? She's here. There's Anna. Great. She will be here to talk all about the International Ocean Film Festival, a terrific thing for us to be doing and to have come from the Bay Area. A little bit about our speaker today. So at 3, he remembers going across the Pacific to Hawaii from California in the Lurley and thinking what a gigantic big boat that was. By age 12, he built his own kayak. I built a boat at 12. My boat lasted about 2 weeks or so, a little pram. His boat did far better, clearly a better craftsman at age 12. And he spent a 50-mile rafting trip down the Colorado River. He points out not the wild part of the Colorado, but 50 miles is 50 miles. At age 14, he learned to sail in the Napa River, as he put it, which separates Vallejo from Mare Island. And what he thought of in those days as swift current and cold water caused him to want to stay on the boat. And as he put it, taught him not to fall overboard as much as some people feared he would. At age 16, he was learning to sail Hobie cats in Hawaii. And at age 17, learned scuba diving, again in Hawaii. And at that point begin to think about the ecological danger that our, oceans are beginning to suffer. He went on to get a Bachelor in Science in Marine Biology from UC Santa Cruz, and then a Master in Science in the same from San Francisco State, Paul's an alma mater and mine, and then got his PhD in marine ecology from UC Davis. And as he's grown aware more of what's happening in the ocean, began to hunt for sustainable models for environmental best practices with our oceans. And it's fitting that 5 years or so ago, he became president of the Marine Conservation Institute, which is all about just exactly that, studying the best environments in the ocean and trying to teach everybody that they can about what makes those places healthy and how to get more such healthy places. So with that, let's give a warm St. Francis welcome to Lance Morgan. Come on up, bud.
All right, well, thank you for the warm intro. Do we need to expand the screen? You guys, a little bit? Oh, you got it. Great. All right, so as introduced, I am president of Marine Conservation Institute. It's an organization that's been around for about 25 years at this point. I've been with them 20 years this May, and feel very blessed to have found a home that long ago that I still feel passionate about and still engaged with. So Blue Parks is this model of sustainability I'm going to tell you a little bit about, but I'm going to run you through kind of a little bit of an arc of how I got here, as well as kind of an arc of where we've been in terms of marine protected areas, both within California, the US, and globally. So you've probably all seen this picture. You're all sailors, appreciate the great big blue. You've probably heard many, many times all the valuable things. Half the oxygen of the world comes out of the oceans. 95% of the habitable space on the planet is in the ocean. But have you thought about what the world would be like without the ocean? So here's a stripped off model of what the Earth looks like without any ocean on it. I equate this to my desire to grow long hair as well. It hides all the scars and bumps and everything else as well. But really, the ocean is significant in a lot of different ways. We get a lot of ecosystem services from it. Recently, we've heard things about blue carbon, the idea that we get a lot of shoreline protection from these different types of environments. We get a lot of benefit, we get a lot of seafood, we get a lot of research and recreational opportunities. We also get some other interesting things we don't really recognize quite so much. So phytoplankton produce this chemical dimethyl sulfide. This is the little particle that is what seeds clouds, and why when we look at the ocean, we really need healthy oceans. These are what's seeding clouds and the rainfall that returns to us. And without these phytoplankton healthy, we don't have that very, very basic service. And I think we also don't necessarily recognize just the tremendous, well, you guys, we do. We get to get out on the water to recreate, but just the pure joy and happiness about being with an ocean environment and the spiritual significance that has. A friend of mine, if he hasn't been here, Wallace Nichols, who talks about the blue mind. If he has, then you guys heard a great talk, but I remember to bring that up because really for a lot of us, it's a really critical part of everything. So as my friends, California sea lions are a really significant part of my career, having worked at the Marine Mammal Center for early parts of the job. As they might say, it's the ocean, and it's been the ocean for a long time. We've had societies going back to 1200 years BC who've recognized and kind of used the ocean and marine life to help inspire their beautiful buildings and all draw this kind of inspiration from the sea. We also recognize this because we like to go to the sea. I was fortunate enough to grow up in Coronado, California. This is the Hotel del Coronado. And this was, just a kind of just something that was in everyday life. And so all this moving and all these different things you heard about really come about because my father was a Navy captain, was in the submarines for over 30 years. But the benefit of jumping around every 2 years was going to a lot of places like this. And Coronado is one of those places where I kind of adopted as home, even though I lived in a lot of different places, and my mother still lives there today. Some of the interesting things I learned about Coronado after I grew up there was that this fish, giant black sea bass, was a common recreational sport fishery in the day. This happens to be 1905 from the slide. And it says one afternoon sport at Coronado, California. You can see the weights of the fish on the site as well. What's interesting about this is that when I lived in Coronado, primarily in the late 60s into the early 70s, this was a species that was functionally extinct. There's a famous marine ecologist, Paul Dayton. He would have called this at the time a ghost of kelp forest pass. It was just not around anymore. No one really, it wasn't totally extinct, but no one saw them. There was no fishery for them. Recreational fishermen weren't catching them. And so this was, as I'd gone through graduate school and spent a lot of time diving in kelp beds and having other experiences, began to kind of read up and better recognize and understand some of these issues. Right out of graduate school, or undergraduate school actually for that matter, I got the opportunity to go to British Columbia and start working on a project with orcas. And at the time, I just thought that was about as magical an experience as I could possibly envision having. These resident whales come through there chasing salmon. But at the time, even with these great experiences and seeing the whales, and we were studying pod structure and how they relate to each other and how they communicate with each other, and they all have their individual calls, and even whales still in captivity today recognize calls from their brethren in the wild. But there was concern that there weren't as many, they weren't doing as well, the salmon. So this is the early 80s. And in fact, if you fast forward to today, there's a lot of issues around the Puget Sound resident orcas. The numbers are down to around 75. It's about somewhere on the order of 35 to 40 whales fewer than there were back when I was up there. So this population's been not reproducing and carrying itself forward, and a lot of that has to do with salmon missing in the Northwest. I've been fortunate enough to do some really pretty exotic things through my graduate work. I learned to scuba dive as a young person, but took that forward to living in this undersea habitat, which is the Key Largo Aquarius habitat off Florida, where you get to spend 2 weeks at a time living in that little submarine in the background. It's actually bolted to the bottom. It's not a submarine at all. And you swim out to these little huts around the reef to change gear and so forth, but spend about 2 weeks at a time on the seafloor. And from that, I actually, we did some coral reef work at the time, but I also had the opportunity to learn how to pilot a one-man submarine for research purposes. And you can see the deep worker there. All of this really got me interested in this topic of marine biodiversity. So it came first through a very academic point of view for me, both being an academic scientist and being trained as a PhD. I thought about, all these great critters and what's going on in the ocean. But I also had this job over at the Marine Mammal Center, and I was seeing, these problems that they still see today. Sometimes it's human caused directly. There's gunshots or entanglements or fish hooks or, just mistaken people in the wrong beach at the wrong time with pups. But then an El Nino hit, and that El Nino drove hundreds of little sea lions up onto the beach that were starving. And I thought, well, okay, so this is natural. Maybe this is something I should think about a little bit more from a standpoint. But what I came to understand was it's not as natural as we really think so. And part of it comes back to this point. So 1883, a great marine scientist, Thomas Huxley, had put out that seas are inexhaustible. There's nothing we can do that will seriously affect the number of fish. People said that about the passenger pigeon as well, right? North America's most abundant bird, hunted to extinction. the great auk, which was extinct in 1844, also basically in this case more because of egg collection, but driven to extinction. So I'm here in this interface of ecology, fishery science, marine biodiversity, and looking at what's going on. And this paper, a relatively famous paper, came out in the early 1990s by a colleague of mine, pointed out that if you really look at the fishery data and tease it apart, there's been a 90% decline in top predators. These are tunas, billfish, swordfish, etc. And this has a lot of implications. This is some of the data that went into that study. You can say just population after population declining. You look at countries like China, and on the opening day of a fishing fleet, this is the fleet heading out to catch fish. And there's the fleet leaving that port. And this is one port in China. And you think about this as it goes around and around the world. You think about the discards, and this is a small boat discard from a gill net. You know, this is catch that wasn't meant to be part of the catch. One of the real important issues that we got involved in as an organization early on was the issue of bottom trawling and the effect on the seafloor. And this is carried through really my entire 20 years with the organization. But these heavy nets get dragged along the seafloor. What we thought was just kind of a muddy bottom is really much more biodiverse and rich and has all kinds of corals and anemones and structures that are actually the homes. These are the, you know, these are the nurseries for little fishes that are going to grow up and be targeted. So it makes sense why they're fishing there, but they didn't recognize the damage they were doing. This is kind of the bycatch. Anybody want to guess what they were actually trying to catch? So in the one with the ray, they're trying to catch the shrimp that's kind of close to it. And that's why you see this bycatch rate of maybe 80%, 90%. And this is what we were dealing with in the 90s into the 2000s. Here's a picture off Florida. Florida has these Oculina Reefs, these stony coral reefs in deeper water. When they're functioning well, lots of fish are on them. After they've been run over a few times, they look like the rubble you see on the other side. And then you have these almost old growth forests on the deep ocean. And this is a picture back from the early 2000s off of New Zealand. But that coral is estimated that it might be as old as 1,000 years. And we now know from other reliable scientific means of aging that corals can live 4,000 to 5,000 years as an individual. This doesn't mean the reefs that have been there maybe, you know, tens of thousands of years. This is just an individual who got fortunate enough to find a great place to land and grew up and was there in this deep environment. We also know that sometimes fishing has these cascading effects that are really important. So as we remove these sharks, what happens to the things sharks predate on? Their population, in this case rays, goes up quite significantly. Okay, no really big deal, until you talk to a scallop fisherman, which the rays are eating as well. And suddenly the scallop fisheries collapse because sharks are gone. Not necessarily a link we think about, but this is how kind of the dominoes of ecosystems start to fall. We've had other projections. This one is a little bit notorious because it kind of played out everything going as bad as possible in the ocean, but talked about the end of seafood, wild seafood by 2048. So this pattern that I'm describing of fishing and overpopulation was really written quite eloquently about by Callum Roberts, and in a very readable book, The Unnatural History of the Sea, in which he just talks about how, you know, at first we were just fishing in the streams and the creeks and the rivers, and then we got into the estuaries, then we got into the coastal waters, and now we're on the high seas. And as we've gone, we've just kind of chunked through the populations, right? We haven't seen much in the way of recovery for the most part. We're just, you know, going farther, building bigger boats, building better gear, getting better navigation. All these are great things, except we're hunting every last corner of the earth at this point for fish. And so, as someone interested in biodiversity, I recognized that fishing really was the main cause of biodiversity loss. And we have new, fun, exciting things coming. Sorry, that's a little sarcastic, but deep sea mining. And that's what a proposed deep sea mining vehicle will look like as it goes into the deep ocean. So as we're seeing not only the loss of biodiversity from fishing, we're seeing this escalation of just industrialization of the ocean at the same time. You guys have probably heard undoubtedly about climate change. It's already here. Time magazine, this was our cover. Anybody remember that cover? That was a 15-year ago cover of Be Worried, Be Very Worried About Climate Change. 2005 or 6 it came out. So there's a lot going on in the ocean, a lot of it very negative. You may have seen this more recent cover from Time, but it's got a lot of us thinking about how do we envision a future? How does Earth survive? This article had a lot of essays about how does Earth survive and get to 2050. And that's really what we started to challenge ourselves with at Marine Conservation Institute. You know, what does it mean for Earth to survive? It's one thing to talk about better management and this and that, but we really are looking forward to what we can do. I'm just as a side, wanted to talk a little bit about ocean acidification. We hear a lot about warming and heat and deoxygenation and sea level rise, but acidification is another big problem for ocean ecosystems. It affects these little pteropods. Pteropods are the primary food for a lot of different types of things that we care about, salmon, cod, and herring. It's also the food for things like humpback whales that we care an awful lot about. But ocean acidification is also an impact on West Coast shellfish fisheries. And so there's quite a lot at stake by the fact that we haven't been addressing climate change. In addition to the other things I've been talking about. We also know that ocean acidification has been a key factor in mass extinctions in historic records. So Charlie Barron from Australia has done a lot of coral, looking at, as a paleontologist, looking at the reef records and can show extinction of coral reefs. Good news is they come back. The bad news is the time frame at which they come back, on the order of 1 million years or longer. So we need to do something to escalate that, to accelerate that. And we need to figure out how we deal with this challenge that's been described as the sixth extinction. So yes, I'm ready to scream. I'm sure you are. I try to put a smile on this and be hopeful. It does weigh heavily on a number of us. I know it weighs heavily on a number of you. I look for some inspiration from some smart people. This quote from Albert Einstein, cannot be solved by thinking the way we thought when we created these problems. One thing we know, as I talked about, not just coral reefs being able to come back if they're given the time, but there's also a lot of evidence of refugia in the ocean, places where species have survived in long periods of time. Coelacanths are a 4 million year old species that have lived in little pockets off the Indian coast of Africa for a long time. We thought they were extinct, but they actually had a little refuge there. Can we use this in thinking about the world? America famously invented national parks. Yellowstone here, pictured as the first national park in 1872. We all have probably been to Yosemite and recognized the power of protecting an area and keeping nature intact. The same thing applies to the ocean. Species can elude extinction in protected places, places where we're not commercially exploiting them and degrading the habitats. We know that there are certain places where important things happen. You know, there's breeding grounds, there's key bottlenecks, there's important habitats. And if we're protecting the habitat, we're not having to necessarily micromanage every piece of the environment. So it's a much more cost-effective strategy. The challenge is this is how a lot of us view the ocean, right? And if you're fortunate enough to get underwater, this is what it looks like. It's dark, it's cold, it's not very appealing. People don't really have any understanding that the average depth of the ocean is 4,000 meters. Just no way to even think about that from our perspective. But we are doing a good job in terms of looking. That was the slide. There we go, we're back. I'm like, what am I doing up there? So these little submarines, and people are doing a good job of exploring. This was a second research trip for me up to British Columbia, and we dove these sites with these submarines. I think the important point of this slide, this is kind of a picture where the submarine was diving on this bank, is that even when we can get there, we're kind of walking a little tiny path through the ocean. It's estimated that with a lot of this research that has gone on, we're still only touching maybe 1% or 2% of the ocean in terms of what we've actually seen. And we're certainly not getting much below about 3,000 feet, 1,000 meters. But here's some of the corals that you might see at these depths and some of the species that live on the corals. I think I'm gonna just show you this picture and not show you the video, but this is a phenomenal video of watching this Dumbo squid. Dumbo meaning they swim with their ears. And if you get a chance to go to Nautilus's site and take a look at that, it's stunning the way it billows. All right, so you found your great important area. What are you gonna do? Well, you could say who you're gonna call. But we have been working to protect places for many years with our founder, Elliot Norse. It started in 1996. We have a team of scientists that help us move through that. But what I learned especially from Elliot was this quote from John F. Kennedy: "Things do not happen, things are made to happen." That means as a scientist, if you want something to happen, don't just publish a paper, go get dirty, go get in the process. So what is a marine protected area? Well, ideally it's a place where you're not exploiting the marine life or degrading the habitats. And they have this great benefit that as fish get larger, they produce a lot more babies. It's not a linear thing, it's a volumetric thing. You know, these fish aren't that different in size, but look at all the different amounts of babies that come from them. We also know that marine reserves will help buffer and provide resilience. There's a lot of different pathways through which this works. One of the most intriguing ones is the fact that whales poop in the surface of the ocean and then dive back down in the deep. And this poop helps generate algae, and algae, as we know, produce DMSO. They also produce oxygen and other things. So there's a lot of benefits to protecting marine life for us. If you take a quick look at how the US is doing, there's at least some folks that refer to this as the Mpa Database, which might make a lot of you ask the question, in this case, through more of a joke. You keep using that term. I do not think it means what you think it means. One of the things, going forward, there we go. We do as an organization is track marine protected areas. These are these places that are reserved for wildlife. So this is just a screenshot of the Atlas of Marine Protection. You can see some of the numbers, some of the things you can explore. But when you dive into these places, they're not really protected, they're managed. And if you dive into what's actually a marine protected area, this is a little bit more accurate of a picture. And if you really dive into marine protection to the point of marine reserves where really no fishing whatsoever, no exploitation goes on, there's just a very few of these marine reserves. And California is lucky enough to have many of them in their waters if you look for the little blue dots. And this is what California's network looks like. Took a lot of work. And a lot of people contributed to this, and those are some of the places that are off the Marin San Francisco coastline. But Elliot, again, there on my right, wasn't afraid to get involved in the political theater. He worked with President Bush. We got Papa Hanaumokuakea, along with many of our colleagues, designated. And this was important because it wasn't just about the coral reef. It was about these ecological interactions. This is fish and seabirds coming together to drive prey to the surface and feed on these things. And this is an ecological interaction that is gone if the fish are gone. The seabirds don't have a place to feed. The Pacific Remote Islands was expanded by President Obama. You might know of it as a famous place where Amelia Earhart was destined, Howland Island. But the other part of the story was that they put these teenage Hawaiians out on that island to prepare the island for Amelia Earhart's arrival when she was sailing. And so there's a great documentary, Under a Jarvis Moon, that talks about these young, it was thought that they were, as being native Hawaiians, they would survive on these islands. So they just sent them out there, and they had about a 7-year history of preparing the islands. And really it was much more about controlling the islands for World War II and in the Pacific. So President Obama expanded this, became the world's largest area. We kicked off this really interesting phenomenon with, different leaders suggesting that everyone wants the largest. So we had Bush create the largest, and then the Chagos, which is part of the British territory, was the Chagos, and Australia got in the mix, and the Cook Islands got in the world's largest. We got Pitcairn, another UK territory, as the largest. And so we had this interesting domino of everybody trying to set up new, big, large MPAs around the world. And that was in part of this target of setting 10% of the ocean aside, which is a UN Sustainable Development Goal and a goal of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Here's what the global picture looks like at the moment. If the green areas on the map are the ocean protected areas, the marine protected areas. These are areas that could be added soon. Spans that up to about 5%, 7%. It's a little hard to count all the time. However, the high seas has less than 1% protected. And this is the area beyond national jurisdictions. These are areas like the Costa Rica Dome, where blue whales from our coast go down to Cav. They're just outside of national jurisdictions, but still need protection. We've worked on trying to identify some of these places. I think what's interesting is that when we think about the oceans, we have one of these globally significant destinations here in Cordell Bank, where marine life travels, seabirds, marine mammals, sea turtles from around the world to feed in our coastal waters. We've also learned some interesting things along the way about the White Shark Cafe. So you can see the tracks of the white sharks as they move between Hawaii and the Bay Area. They concentrate in an area. They leave our coastal waters where they're protected, but they head out into the high seas where they're not protected. So there's a number of organizations working through the High Seas Alliance right now to get a treaty for protection of marine life on the high seas and the creation of marine protected areas. So if you add all of this up, which we do, and you look at what is really highly protected, it's about 2.2 to 2.3% of the ocean. If you add it to areas that have some protection, but not potentially as much as we'd like to see, you're almost to 5%. And then there's another 2.6% that people have claimed they're going to protect. So we're not yet at that 10% target, and yet we know the 30% target is where we need to go. And if you plot out kind of the growth in MPAs, sorry, there's a lot going on here, but what I will just draw your attention to, we've been slowly creating more and more of these things, and you saw those big areas added. But even at the current trajectory of this escalated, accelerated growth, we're only going to be at 15% in 2030. So there's still a lot of work that needs to get there. And this is a kind of just a schematic of what 30% might look like. Again, the shaded areas being protected. And of course, it's not just about protected areas, it's about making sure the whole ocean has some sort of management. So, really strictly protected areas, but areas where other types of activities continue as well. So we got started into, well, it's not just about the quantity, we really need to think about the quality, and we really need to think about how effective these areas are. And this is a really missing part of the equation. And so this is, another inspirational quote for me, I hope for you, but to change something, you need to build a new model. You need to kind of think about not just working within the existing confines. On land, we were worried about nuclear war, and we designed a seed vault. In Star Trek, they were worried about bringing humpback whales back, so they jettisoned them from the future. Reality is neither of those are really going to work for the ocean. But we do think we can incentivize stronger protection through this idea of blue parks. So we started looking around at where really effective marine protected areas were. We did a lot of work with scientists, with scientific research, diagnosing when they worked, why they worked, where they worked, what the circumstances were. Strong regulations. These are some of them. They have to be no-take. They have to be well enforced. The older they are, the better they are. They get better with age. Larger is better than smaller. And isolation helps as well. We also know that you need to have management. You need to be in the right places. This is the Great Barrier Reef. All the red spots are the important spots. All the green spots are where it's protected. They don't overlap all that well. So when you get into battles with user groups, sometimes the user groups win access to those areas. We put these into a series of criteria. For MPAs, we work through our Science Council, this international group of scientists, to help us engage these folks, and we run through an award process every year. The first year we had 3 of these, including Papahanaumokuakea, which is the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, Malpelo off of Colombia, and Mpa Reefs in the Philippines. And these areas really demonstrate the high bar. So we tried to model then working with them and what are we going to do to expand this effort. One of the things we do is recognize them and promote them so that their story can be told to other MPA managers. And so at international venues, we will present these awards. This year we have the Northern Channel Islands as an award, which was a really great example of state and federal guys working together. Try and skip through that. Seychelles won an award this year, and they take it seriously. This is the Minister of the Environment with me on the stage accepting the award for his blue park, which is Aldabra Atoll in this case, out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I said the Channel Islands received an award. This is the living version of the fish that was on the stringer back in 1905. They have rebounded. The Channel Islands have had a lot of good protection now for going on about 20 years. These fish have found their way back and they've grown. And so, you know, if you need any proof that these are working, the Channel Islands has this great dramatic example of a species that was almost completely extinct having come back. These are now the 16 blue parks around the world. These are the partners we work with. And I'm gonna jump one more step ahead. So we're still working on some campaigns in California. The California Seamount campaign is one in which Sylvia Earle has designated a hope spot. We're trying to get to explore, look at these areas. Here's a quick seafloor map of ones right off our coast, Pioneer and Gumdrop Seamounts, kind of straight west of here. And we're trying to make sure that we have a coalition developed around this area to help protect these areas and places where we're looking to do more. This kind of outreach to make people aware of this. Another cool bit of video I won't show. Show it? All right. Let's see if I can get it to roll. Oop, I can't get it. Why didn't it go? Let's see if we go back. Sorry. No, I can't see. Anyway, since it's Martin Luther King week, I'll give you my Martin Luther King quotes with apologies for stealing Julie Packard's Twitter feed to get these quotes to you, but I'm not sure why. All right, well, I'll show it to you later. Anyway, that is a whale fall. This is a whale fall. Whale fall meaning a whale that fell off to the seafloor on Davidson Seamount and has now got thousands of octopus crawling all over it. I couldn't get it to. It always works great at home, but. All right. So anyway, so whale falls again. One of the things, it's estimated whale population might be only 25% of what they were historically. It's a big lump of carbon that hits the seafloor. So one thing, it's sequestering carbon to the deep sea just by virtue of it. But we really do need to look at this idea, and there's been a lot of discussion about whales themselves just being blue carbon, ways to sequester things. So with that, it's always, the time is always right to do what is right. I look forward to having you all find out more about blue parks, talk to me, follow up. If you have any questions, Sebastian here is also part of our team, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. All right, thank you.
Great. Put your water right here. Well, welcome again to our Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Lance Morgan, our guest today, can tell us all about marine protected areas. First off, Lance, what percent of the Earth's surface is ocean?
Roughly about 70% of the Earth's surface is the ocean, and about, half of that, is that right? Maybe my numbers are off. The high seas is about half of the surface of the Earth.
And what are the top 3 ways that the oceans support life on Earth?
Well, I didn't talk enough about the connection between oceans and climate, but if you're talking about climate change, you're automatically talking about oceans. The oceans not only produce oxygen, they're also sequestering the carbon. It's estimated about 70% of the CO2 is going back into the ocean. That's leading to a lot of heating, but the ocean's probably absorbed about 90% of the heat so far. And as I was trying to allude to with that little picture early on, we really, there's this interface here between the sea and the atmosphere, but it's really just one of a degree. All the water and the moisture in the atmosphere is really a result of the ocean. So just from a basic life support system, the ocean is why we're here.
So before any, marine protected areas or people actively trying to recover the environment, what parts of the ocean are the healthiest right now, and what parts are the least healthy globally?
Well, I think that's a matter of degree in a lot of ways. So to answer it in broad strokes, we have least influence into the really deep ocean right now. But we know the deep ocean is already heating and showing signs of stress. And of course, the coastal zones are where we've had the greatest impact. There is really no part of the ocean that has not been exploited at this point. And so we don't really think about there being a pristine ocean anymore. There are places in relatively better shape. And of course, you probably all are aware of the real dire consequences for coral reefs in terms of the warming and the bleaching that's gone on there.
No, but so tell us, where is the ocean healthiest? Where is it least healthy? Is it least healthy on the shore and most healthy in the deepest water, or otherwise?
I think at the moment, that's a generality. That's true pretty much everywhere. I think there are zones like the South China Sea, which would probably be thought of as being relatively unhealthy, just because of the amount of, fishing pressure, the amount of human pressure, the amount of shipping, just the coastline pieces. The places where we have the least human impact right now are still the poles and an area kind of in the Pacific that kind of sits between kind of South America and New Zealand in terms of just the amount of impact.
So now your solution is, and it's ambitious, is to create marine protected areas. Did I hear you say there are currently 16? How many of them are there right now?
So we have 16 blue parks. There's actually, so this is an interesting challenge, and one at which there are about 15,000 marine protected areas that are self-reported by governments around the world. Okay. We started the Atlas of Marine Protection to better characterize this, and we found ourselves kind of always being the bad cop, right? That's not a very good MPA, you're not doing it right, you're not really stopping fishing. You allow dynamite fishing in your protected area. How does that work? And so that was hard to say. Dynamite? Yeah, that's hard to say, yeah, we should do marine protected areas, but they're all really bad. And that, as a conservation group worried about how you communicate to the public, you can't really, you got to somehow reconcile those. And we reconciled those by looking at this program to promote and work with the good ones as examples for everybody to, and then we have a way to engage the ones that aren't very good to bring them forward. And now that we've had a couple of years of success with this program, that indeed is happening. People are coming to us. They say, how do I get to be a blue park? How do I get this award? What do I need to do? In fact, Maria Brown from Gulf of the Farallones is, always asking me, what do I need to do? What are we going to do? When can we get this award? And I'm like, well, we got to stop trawling in the Gulf of the Farallones. That would be a good start.
So how do we measure the benefit? How do we measure the benefit of a marine protected area? What are the metrics?
So there is a lot of good science. So ideally, what you really want is someone who can go out there and assess the populations, look at the biodiversity, look at the water quality, and have all these evaluations. So one of the things we look for, has an MPA developed its own management plan that says we think these are the biggest 10 threats. We're monitoring these 10 threats, we're abating these 10 threats. That goes a long ways towards dealing with it, but it's a little bit unique to the protected area in terms of what it actually needs to deal with. The challenges for Gulf of the Farallones, where there's a lot of fishing and boating and shipping, is much different than the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, where there is no human presence for the most part.
Now, I'm going to keep asking questions because, by golly, what a fascinating subject. However, you're going to have questions. And so our own celebrity chairman, Paul Kayard, has graced us with, he'll handle the mic. So if you have a question, put your hand up like this. Paul will come over and give us your short, concise question. Hold your hand up, get Paul to see you, and we'll get your question. So, okay.
So we have these protected zones, blue parks and all that, but who is there a legal, is there some kind of legal entity that manages that? Or like, let's say it's outside the coastal waters of a nation, so it's in the international waters. How are those protected zones actually controlled and regulated?
Thanks for the question, Paul.
Yeah,
So the people out there in the Never Never Land hear us. His mic wasn't working just right. How do we measure and regulate marine protected areas?
So for California, we have 3 miles under state jurisdiction, which is kind of cooperatively managed with the federal government. And the state has the Marine Life Protection Act initiative, which is really the world's gold standard for designing and implementing and monitoring a network of marine protected areas. And about 15% of state waters are in that network. The federal government has things like fish and wildlife refuges, national parks, national marine sanctuaries, and marine national monuments. So there's a lot of actually tools to be used. Implementing them effectively is a challenge, and that's part of why, as an NGO, we're kind of looking in from the outside a little bit as a watchdog on these. But when you get to the high seas, the areas beyond national jurisdictions, there are rules for pollution and there are rules for shipping, but there are no rules that enable marine protected areas to be enacted. And so as a result of that, I mentioned the work at the UN, which is ongoing right now. We're in we'll have the 4th round of negotiations here in March, start off to try and move this treaty forward so the international community could actually have a marine protected area standard and then move to enact those things.
How big and small, what's a small marine protected area and how big is a big one? For instance, the Bay Area, would that be 1/8 of a small marine protected area? How big are these things?
No, the Bay Area would be considered a relatively good sized one.
The Bay Area.
If you did, San Francisco Bay would certainly be considered big area. I think the approach that we would recommend for an area like this would be to set up a network, and the network would mean there'd be areas that are no go and no use, and there maybe would be a seabird colony there or something. But then surrounded by that would be a buffer where there might be some limit activities, and so you would kind of provide this zoning scheme, and that's actually what the state did. So something on the order of 1 to 10 square kilometers kind of fits in that. 100 square kilometers, I don't know how to convert that into miles on the top of my head, but is considered to be kind of a threshold of where you get to enough of what's going on inside that area is buffered from activities around it.
100 square kilometers, so 10 by 10.
Right.
So 7 miles by 7 miles or so.
Yeah.
50 square miles. Okay. Paul had a question. Yeah, buddy.
Hello, Alexandra Post, author of Deep Sea Mining and the Law of the Sea.
Hi, Alex. I see you here.
Great.
Thank you. Welcome.
Now, thank you. I have 3 questions. And my company is Clean Ship Fuel, and I'm very interested in the impact of shipping fuel on acidity and the rest of what's going on in the underwater. And I'm very concerned about what you think about migratory birds like the albatross that have been tagged and flown to the moon and back in terms of distance. And searching for food, and they typically pick up plastic. And we are converting plastics into clean ship fuel. So I'm very much concerned about your remarks. And my third problem is that there's commercial tourism in the Northwest Passage, and Norway and other neighboring areas of the Arctic are heavy into ice breaking. And it's the area that's going to flood Europe more than any other area. And what can we do about that?
Well, I think you know that for the first question, which is probably the one I can handle the best because I'm not sure about the others, that definitely ship fuel and diesel and bunker fuel and these things are a big concern and the source of a lot of conversations about how do we reduce those things, especially as shipping continues to grow. And California and the Channel Islands, where I was one of the parks I was talking about, have done quite a bit of work with the shipping industry to try and use different fuels and obey different air regulations as they come in. But that mostly has to do with the impact on the LA air quality. But they have switched fuels and are looking more into that. But that's certainly not the same issue as just what does the additional CO2 into the atmosphere mean for ocean acidification, and where that lag is still going to go on for a long time. CO2 emissions are still growing. There's a lot out there, and that's going to continue to go into the ocean as it equilibrates and will continue to drive changes in acidity for quite a while. And I don't know that we can try and head that off in the future, but it's going to get worse before it gets better, no matter what we do, just because of the lag inherent in this global biogeochemistry. But I applaud the way to look at different forms of shipping and green shipping. I think for me, one of the issues for the shipping industry is looking at whale strikes and how they can better work with information around whale strikes and how does that alleviate it. I was part of a vessel task force group here in the Bay Area, trying to get ships to slow down coming through, because we do have blue whales, humpback whales, gray whales that are hit and are routinely hit. Some of them show up on beaches. We don't really have a good feel for that. So trying to figure out how we can deal better with these high abundance of whales, and how we route shipping is a big issue, or slow down shipping, or what we do to manage that is a big challenge. As far as the Arctic, yes, we're going in the Arctic. I don't think the challenges there, as countries see the opportunity, is to try and get in front of them. There are groups and trying to work on different treaties to protect the Arctic and limit the activity up there. The nations around the Arctic have an Arctic Council, and it kind of involves a lot of indigenous people's feedback as well. But it is a big challenge what to do with that one.
So, but Lance, her specific question was, what are you going to do about the Russians and their icebreakers, the Ruskies?
Yeah, I'm probably not doing a lot about that, but we are looking to, push forward additional protected areas. And one of the interesting pieces there is what, now that we have a better understanding about things about exploitation, what can we do about other types of activities that are ongoing and improve that? And so part of that UN treaty we talked about is can we bring the shipping and the protection and the biodiversity and the pollution standards all together into kind of one comprehensive assessment that doesn't take another 10 years to negotiate, because we really don't have that time, but in a comprehensive manner, so that one group isn't mining where another group is fishing or set aside for fishing, and that we have to bring some structure to that. That's a big part of this UN treaty.
Okay.
Got one here.
First of all, thanks for your work.
Yes.
It strikes me this is like elephant tusks, requiring a dedicated police force, professional or amateur. How has that worked? What has practice been like, especially as we lose more arable land to global warming? There's food down there.
Well, the good news is there's a lot of attention being paid to what does enforcement and monitoring look like. The age of satellites and Big Brother is being well used in the ocean community to look at where boats are. And there's kind of two types of things going on there. There's the one where boats, because vessel owners are interested in where their boats are, have a signal, an AIS signal that is read and that's reported. And people look at where those boats are in relationship to fishery zones or marine protected areas. But the other is we're increasingly able to actually look at an area and go, oh, there's boats there that don't have their AIS on, or they're not AIS equipped. And that's just getting better and better. So Global Fishing Watch, some of these other tools are more and more available, and they're not perfect yet. They're going to take a lot more development, but as more and more satellites are up, there's a lot more eyes in the sky. That has a whole lot of implications. But if you're, hoping to be, legally enforcing these things, there's a lot of hope there. But there's also a lot of groups that appreciate that if you're going to manage an MPA, you really do have to credibly manage it. You can't let just the illegal guys come and go as they want. You have to make sure there's some reliable means of detecting and then intercepting these activities. And that is a big challenge still, but one that's gotten a lot better.
So in broad global terms, how is climate change affecting species survival? Are we getting more scavenger fish? Are we getting more microorganisms because of bacteria in the water? How globally is it changing the population of life in the sea?
That is a very good question. Very challenging question. We do know that a lot of species are moving northward. And that the tropics and the less developed countries around the tropics are probably going to be one of the more impacted in terms of, especially fisheries moving away from them. There are also challenges for, places like Northern California. You may have heard of the blob, this warm water period that was resident here for a couple of years and had, 100, at least tens of thousands of seabirds die as a result of the blob not allowing. Basically, this blob was a lot of warm water that shut down upwelling. So it shut down the productivity, it shut down the small fish production, which is what the seabirds need to feed on. And if the fish were there, they were deeper in the water below this warm water. And so many tens of thousands of seabirds from kind of Northern California up into British Columbia and Southeast Alaska died during this event. We also saw our kelp beds have a big period of die-off, which led to some cascading issues for abalone and sea urchins that have been really destructive. So I think we're seeing pieces of climate change play out all over the planet, but they play out a little bit differently. And there are different species that are going to come to dominate, and I don't know we can really actually predict that.
Can you identify species that are thriving and those that are maybe failing in the oceans now? Certain types of species?
I'm not sure
Okay.
I can answer that question.
So how does the ocean, here's a question, Paul, there's one up here. Matt's got one.
Sorry,
Matt
I'm not
Giannetti.
doing my job. Hi, Lance. Thank you. Just, imagine you're at the grocery store, Whole Foods, trying to do the right thing. You see line caught wild, but then you see farmed up in Norway, sustainably farmed. And if you could just comment about fish farming versus line caught, and you have all the bycatch, and then also this new concept of offshore fish farms and fish feeds and trends in that regard.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I try to at this point limit a lot of seafood, but try to go with kind of local, sustainable operations. Folks that maybe have a much smaller but more intimate relationship. So steering away from big fish farms. Typically, and I would say Canada and Chile are not very good examples. Norway's probably better on an overall if you're going to eat farm salmon, but I still don't know that I would recommend that. And part of that has to do, in fact, with you're growing a carnivorous animal and it needs to eat about 4 times its weight, and it's eating you're feeding it other sea life to get it there. Maybe there'll be some innovations around vegetarian feeds or something, plant-based feeds that might work in the future. The fisheries that are most destructive are the ones that are like trawling and dredging on the seafloor, though there's some examples in some places where they've made some interesting innovations. I would go to Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch, honestly, and use that. And I tend to, think about it from the standpoint of smaller scale fisheries and not these larger scale boats, and avoid things like, pollock and the worst of the farmed fish. And truthfully, farmed shrimp is got quite an impact in different parts of the world as well.
Negative impact?
Negative impact, yeah.
So let me see if I understood what you said. Are you saying you're not supportive of ocean farming, and it's better for us to buy wild caught salmon? Give us some guidance.
Well, I think if salmon's a really tough one, because no matter what we do, and we want to support these local communities, salmon just aren't really doing great. Some of the Alaska fisheries are kind of holding on, and the Bristol Bay and the Pebble Mine issue and things around that. I definitely come down with trying to side with the fishermen there, who are doing what they can to kind of keep a sustainable fishery going there. But when there's runs in California as small as they are, I really feel like I'm not probably going to go eat local salmon anymore until some of these things recover. And I'm not, that's not trying to be negative about the fishermen from California. That's just kind of this, we really need a lot more energy put into recovering salmon. So I don't have a perfect answer for you.
So does that mean you go for farmed salmon? Because
no, I don't eat
hurt
farmed salmon myself. I try to avoid the farmed salmon. And I think one of the ones that I would feel okay eating is like sockeye salmon from Alaska.
Okay, because the stocks are strong enough there.
It's a better, yeah.
We're all waiting on the edge of our plate. We want to know what to eat here.
Yeah, I mean, there are, so that's why I referred you to the Seafood Watch card, because they do a pretty good job of trying to, factor all these different pieces into it. Individual market chains are a little bit, sometimes they wobble around a little bit. Some are better than others. There's a lot of attention paid for this, and I would just kind of, refer you to those different types of tools.
So before Kim Dessenberg asks his question, we want to ask him one. He's done well in the Three Bridge fiasco. Have you looked at the weather and which way you going this weekend?
I've decided to go clockwise every year, and sometime it's going to be right.
Earlier, we heard Bill, our Vice Commodore, Bill Dana, talk about the Three Bridge fiasco, which is this Bay Area homegrown regatta, which is now the largest sailboat race in the country. And what makes it marvelous is 3 marks in any sequence in any direction. So you can go ABC, or you can go BCA, or you can go CAB, and you can round them in any direction. So it's always a very fun test, and it's only 1 or 2 person boats. So it's really a very good collection of the great sailors of the Bay. And you didn't give us any hints at all, Kim, so we're going to let you ask a question.
Okay, I don't think it's possible to predict which is the right way till the race is over.
We're going to run him for mayor. President, right? We have an opening, don't we?
My question is, our federal government has proposed protected area for orcas along the west coast of North America down to California. I wondered if you can tell us about that, and is it progressing?
Well, I think what they've proposed is actually a critical habitat designation, which means it's an important habitat. If any rules go along with that, it isn't necessarily mean anything at the moment. So critical habitat really means that federal activities need to take into consideration what it would do for the endangered species that's listed with the critical habitat. So it can be very powerful. If we found like this spot is where orcas are feeding, it could lead to a regulation that says we're not going to fish on that one spot. And there, in Puget Sound, there are places called Salmon Bank, right? There are no salmon on them anymore, but they were called that because salmon and orcas and everybody piled up on those banks at certain times of years, and those aren't there anymore. So there are, some historical things to look at that. But at the moment, that it is going to be without any kind of restriction except for planning of future federal activities.
Vice Commodore Dana. Oh, thanks, Paul. What about consumer products? So we all know plastic is terrible, but what about things like sunscreens that are really impacting the reefs, deterioration, that kind of thing? You working with anybody on that?
There are a growing number of groups that are aware of the toxicity of certain sunscreens. Hawaii has banned any of those from being sold in their country. Palau as a nation has ban those. I think that it's an important piece of it to recognize what's going on there and what needs to happen. It's a toxicity, especially to corals that are very sensitive to it. I think it's corals suffer from death by 1,000 cuts. So if you can have a couple of those and not be as bad, I think that's an important step. But it's not going to solve coral reef problems in and of itself.
So the last time I was in Kauai, I put my hand through the water in the beach, and there were all these microplastics. It just boggled my mind. I couldn't take it. But then I began to wonder, well, so that's in the top, 6 inches of water. What about deeper in the water? So the question is, well, we're paying lots of attention to the Pacific gyre and plastic and stuff we can see on the surface of the ocean, 3,000 feet down. Is anybody doing anything to clean? And what's the feasibility of, in fact, cleaning the carpet that's underneath the oceans, the base seabed?
Yeah,
we're giving you all the easy questions.
You guys are asking great questions, and they're all really well informed and quite challenging to deal with. And that's one of the big problems we have, is how complex many of these problems are. I think the plastic solution really relies in reducing the use and trying to put more trash wheels in estuaries and things like this in rivers, trying to keep it from going out into the ocean. The problem with thinking about trying to clean plastic up once it's in the ocean is somehow you've got to collect it. And right now we can't just collect the plastic. We have to collect the marine life and everything else that's with it. And so that's a cost to, if you're going to do any kind of massive scale activity, you're going to collect an awful lot of plankton and zooplankton, microorganisms, et cetera, in the ocean with it. So proposing being the perfect trash man is beyond what we can actually technologically and feasibly do. It's probably not the right approach as well. I mean, there may be a time in which, I don't know, we can geoengineer a microbe that will eat plastic or something like that and reduce it. But the question about seafood is also a question about how much plastic are you willing to ingest. Pretty much every wild animal at this point in the ocean is ingesting some sort of plastic. And when you eat that, you're ingesting some of those plastic pieces as well. But I think that really the focus ought to be eliminating use, figuring out ways to have more recyclable uses, and then cleaning up rivers and estuaries so that the plastic doesn't wash downstream and into the ocean. I don't know we have a solution for your problem. Cleaning the deep ocean.
Question.
So
the most recent staff, the newest
junior. We've just had an example in the news of the Tasman Sea being shallow, warm, losing all its kelp, being sort of a microcosm of the consequences of global warming. And I was wondering how you would design a marine protected area near enough to repopulate that, assuming things could get better, and deep enough and cool enough and whatever.
Right. Well, so there's kind of two things you can do with marine protected areas. One is try and keep as many things alive so that if you're in a network, you have this kind of source population to repopulate areas. And the other one is to think about them as ways of storing and mitigating just carbon production by being healthier and more productive and working. Once you have, so in a situation like that, the hope will be that they have other source populations that once environmental conditions, somehow moderate, that they'll be able to restore. So California's approach was this network in which there are sizing and spacing guidelines up and down the coast. So if something bad happens in one place, there's populations to either side that potentially can come back. And this is kind of why not only do you have to think about it from a one-off, but you have to think about it from a system as well. And that gets a little bit more challenging.
Well, Lance Morgan, president of the Marine Conservation Institute, thanks very much for sharing your time with the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. And with that, the meeting's adjourned.